Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku met his future self. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The moon was a cold, silver coin pasted onto the vast, velvet expanse of the night sky. At the Heights Alliance dormitory of UA High, silence reigned. It was a heavy, profound silence, the kind that only settles after a day of intense emotions and forced normalcy. Inside, Class 1A slept, or at least pretended to, each student processing the recent cataclysm at Kamino Ward in their own way. The retirement of All Might, the symbol of peace, had left a gaping hole in the fabric of their world, a vacuum that felt both terrifying and absolute. But outside, in the manicured grounds between the main building and the forest known as the Beast's Den, one student was not still. Izuku Midoriya's breath sawed in and out of his lungs, each gasp a cloud of white in the cool night air. Sweat plastered his green and black hair to his forehead, stinging his eyes. His body screamed in protest, a symphony of aching muscles and protesting joints, but he ignored it. He had to. 80%, just for a moment. He crouched low, the familiar green lightning of One for All crackling around him, more agitated than usual. The power felt like a living thing under his skin, a wild stallion he was trying to tame with fraying reins. He focused on the sensation, channeling it from the core of his being down through his legs. The ground beneath his worn-out sneakers trembled. Full cowl, 8%. He exploded forward, a blur of motion across the dew-slicked grass. The world became a smear of dark greens and blacks, the only clear point of focus the thick, ancient oak tree he designated as his target. The pressure felt immense, not just from the quirk, but from the invisible mantle that had been thrust upon him. All Might's power. All Might's legacy. All Might's burden. He pushed off his right foot, pivoting, and launched a kick at the tree's trunk. Manchester. Smash! The impact was less a smash and more a concussive thud. The tree shuddered, leaves raining down like green confetti, but it remained standing, its ancient strength a quiet rebuke to his efforts. A sharp, angry pain shot up his leg, a familiar warning sign. He'd put too much force into it again, the controls slipping for a fraction of a second. He landed awkwardly, stumbling a few feet before catching himself, hissing through his teeth. He pressed a hand to his shin, feeling the deep, throbbing ache that promised a spectacular bruise by morning. Useless, he muttered, the word a bitter taste in his mouth. He wasn't talking about the tree. He sank to his knees, the lightning of full cowl sputtering out, leaving him feeling small and cold. He was chasing a ghost. Every day, he replayed it in his mind, All Might, skeletal and broken, raising a single, triumphant fist to the sky. The United States of Smash. The end of an era. The last embers of the symbol of peace. And then, All Might's gaunt, pointed finger on live television. Next, it's your turn. The words haunted his every waking moment, and stalked him in his dreams. How could it be his turn? He could barely handle 8% of the power without threatening to tear himself apart. All Might had wielded this quirk like a force of nature, a living hurricane of justice and hope. In Izuku's hands, it felt like a lit stick of dynamite with a faulty, unpredictable fuse. He looked down at his scarred hands, the mangled topography of his journey so far. Each scar was a reminder of a lesson learned in blood and bone, a testament to his reckless desperation. But they didn't feel like badges of honor. They felt like marks of failure. Proof that he wasn't worthy. That he was an imposter, a fraud playing dress-up in a legend's shoes. The pressure was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had to get stronger. Faster. He had to become someone people could look to and feel safe. Just as he had when he'd watched that old video of All Might saving hundreds of people with a fearless smile. But his own smile felt fragile, a poorly constructed mask he wore for his mother and his friends. Inside, he was terrified. He pushed himself back to his feet, ignoring the screaming protest from his leg. He couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the world was watching, waiting. Not when villains, emboldened by All Might's absence, were starting to crawl out of the woodwork. He owed it to All Might. He owed it to everyone. Again, he whispered, his voice hoarse. He began to draw on One for All once more, the green energy coiling around him. But as the power started to build, something felt wrong. It began subtly. The incessant chirping of the night crickets abruptly ceased, plunging the grounds into an unnerving silence. The air, once cool and crisp, grew heavy and static, like the charged atmosphere before a lightning strike. The fine hairs on his arms and the back of his neck stood on end. Izuku's own quirk reacted instinctively, the green lightning around him flickering erratically, like a nervous tick. He froze, scanning the perimeter. His senses, honed by countless battles and Aizawa-sensei's brutal training, screamed at him that he was no longer alone. He dropped his stance, every muscle tensed, ready to fight or flee. A villain? Here? At Yue? After everything, had their security been breached again? Then he saw it. About 50 yards away, near the edge of the forest, the air began to shimmer, distorting like a heat haze on a summer road. But this was no heat haze. The distortion intensified, twisting and warping space itself. A low hum vibrated through the soles of his shoes, growing rapidly into a deep, guttural groan, the sound of reality being torn apart at the seams. A pinprick of light appeared in the center of the distortion, an impossibly bright emerald green. It expanded violently, not like a blossoming flower, but like a shattered pane of glass. Black, jagged lines shot out from it, crawling through the air like veins of solidified shadow. The emerald light pulsed, and with it came a wave of raw, untamed power that made Izuku's own one for all recoil in what felt like shock and recognition. It was the same energy, the same fundamental essence, but it was wrong. It was wilder, darker, tinged with an aura of profound despair and rage. The pinprick became a gaping maw, a swirling vortex of emerald and obsidian. It didn't just occupy the space, it devoured it, sucking in light and sound. The grass around its edges turned black and withered to dust. The groan of tortured physics became a deafening shriek that scraped at Izuku's ears. He threw an arm up to shield his eyes from the blinding, strobing light. The sheer pressure emanating from the vortex was crushing, forcing him to his knees. It felt like standing at the epicenter of an earthquake and a hurricane at the same time. He could feel the power within him, the legacy of the vestiges, stirring in alarm. It was a chaotic, terrifying symphony, and his own quirk was a single, trembling note within it. Then, as suddenly as it began, the vortex imploded. With a final, deafening crack that sounded like the world snapping in half, it vanished, leaving behind a sudden, shocking silence and the acrid smell of ozone and burnt sugar. And a figure. Where the heart of the vortex had been, a man lay crumpled on the scorched, blackened earth. He had been spat out by the temporal storm, and he'd fallen hard. For a moment he didn't move, a dark shape against the ruined ground. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. His hero instincts, buried under a moment of pure, primal fear, surged to the forefront. Injured person. He had to help. He pushed himself up, his legs shaking, and began to approach cautiously. Hello? He called out, his voice trembling. Are you okay? There was no response. As he drew closer, the moonlight offered more details, and each one sent a fresh spike of alarm through him. The man was tall, far taller and broader than Izuku, with a physique that spoke of years of relentless, brutal combat. He was built like a heavyweight boxer, all dense, corded muscle. His hero costume was a dark, forest green, almost black in the dim light, and it was in tatters. It was shredded at the shoulders and legs, scorched black across the chest, and in some places, the high-tech fabric looked as though it had been fused to the scarred skin beneath. It was a design Izuku recognized with a sickening lurch, an advanced, militarized version of his own gamma costume. As he got closer still, the extent of the man's injuries became terrifyingly clear. His exposed skin was a roadmap of violence. A starburst-shaped scar puckered the skin on his left cheek, and a long, pale line ran from just below his ear down to his collarbone, a scar that looked like it should have been fatal. But the most jarring feature was his right arm. From the shoulder down, it wasn't flesh and blood. It was a marvel of engineering, a prosthetic limb of gleaming chrome and dark carbon fiber, currently dented and scraped, with a few wires sparking feebly at the elbow joint. The man stirred, letting out a low groan that was less a sound of pain and more one of infinite, soul-crushing weariness. He pushed himself up with his one good arm, his movements stiff and agonized. He got to one knee, his head bowed, his breathing ragged and heavy. Izuku was only 10 feet away now. He could see the man's hair. It was the same wild, unruly mess of dark green curls as his own, but it was longer, dirtier, with streaks of gray at the temples that seemed utterly out of place. "Are you hurt?" "I can get recovery, girl," Izuku offered, his voice still shaky but now filled with genuine concern. This man looked like he had walked out of a war zone. The man's head slowly lifted. The moonlight fell across his face, and Izuku's world tilted on its axis. It was his own face. It was his face, but it was a version that had been hammered and reforged in a crucible of unimaginable pain. The jawline was harder, the cheeks were leaner, and the freckles, his own familiar boyish freckles, were still there, but they seemed like faint, ghostly echoes on a canvas of hardened resolve and deep-seated trauma. And his eyes, Izuku's own eyes, were wide, green, and often filled with a bright, sometimes tearful, earnestness. This man's eyes were the same shade of green, but they were sunken, shadowed, and held a haunted, chilling emptiness. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss for so long that the abyss had taken up permanent residence within him. They were the eyes of a soldier who had seen the end of the world. Izuku stumbled back a step, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. A twin? A relative? A villain with a transformation quirk? None of it made sense. The resemblance was too perfect, too fundamentally him. The man's haunted green eyes locked onto Izuku's. For a long moment he just stared, his expression a maelstrom of emotions too complex for Izuku to decipher: grief, regret, a flicker of something that might have been surprise, and a bone-deep agony that seemed to radiate from him like a physical force. He tried to speak, but it came out as a harsh, guttural cough. He clutched his chest with his flesh-and-blood hand, his whole body trembling with the effort. He looked down at his own hand, then back up at Izuku, a flicker of desperate urgency igniting in the depths of his gaze. "You!" he rasped, and the voice sent a shudder down Izuku's spine. It was a ruin of a voice, a low, gravelly timbre that sounded like it had been shredded by screams and choked on ash. But beneath the damage, the cadence, the fundamental pitch, it was his own. It was what his voice might sound like in 20 years if he spent every day shouting and gargling rocks. "You have to listen to me," the man forced out, each word a monumental effort. He leaned forward, his prosthetic arm clanking against the ground as he used it to brace himself. He was looking at Izuku as if he were a ghost, a memory brought to life. Izuku couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, trapped between the instinct to run and the overwhelming, morbid curiosity. Who was this man? The man saw the terror and confusion on Izuku's face. He knew he had to offer proof, something undeniable. With a trembling left hand, he reached up and pulled down the tattered, dark green mask that still clung to the lower half of his face. The mask had concealed the thin, cruel-looking scar that cut across his lips, but its removal revealed the final, irrefutable truth. The shape of his chin. The line of his mouth. The pattern of the freckles. It was all there. A perfect, if brutalized, mirror. "My name," the man said, his voice cracking with a sorrow so profound it felt like it could swallow the world, "is Izuku Midoriya." He paused, his gaze boring into his younger self, forcing him to accept the impossible reality. "And I failed." The words hung in the silent night air, heavier than any physical weight. They were not an accusation. They were a confession. A verdict. An epitaph for a future that hadn't happened yet. Izuku's mind went completely blank. The world dissolved into a meaningless buzz of white noise. Izuku Midoriya. I failed. The sentence echoed in the hollow space where his thoughts should have been. This man, this broken, scarred warrior from a nightmare, was him. This was his future. This was the end result of all his training, all his striving, all his desperate attempts to live up to All Might's legacy. Failure. His legs finally gave out, and he collapsed onto the grass, his eyes wide with a horror that eclipsed anything he had ever felt before. Not the Noma at the USJ, not the terrifying presence of the hero killer, not even All for One himself had inspired this kind of deep, personal dread. This wasn't a monster he had to fight. This was a mirror showing him a monster he could become. Before either of them could say another word, a new sound cut through the stillness. "Don't move! Both of you!" The voice was sharp, tired, and utterly commanding. Izuku's head snapped up. Standing at the edge of the clearing, his long black hair seeming to float around him and his eyes glowing a menacing red, was Shota Aizawa. His capture weapon, a ribbon of gray alloy, was already unfurled and writhing like a nest of snakes, ready to strike. He had clearly been woken by the energy surge and had come expecting a full-blown attack. Behind him, another figure emerged from the shadows of the dormitory building, moving with a stiff, hurried gait. A skeletal silhouette, all sharp angles and hollowed cheeks, with wild, horn-like bangs of blonde hair. "Young Midoriya!" Tashinori Yagi called out, his voice thin but laced with panic. He skidded to a halt beside Aizawa, his sunken blue eyes wide as they took in the scene, the scorched earth, his terrified-looking successor on the ground, and the strange, heavily armed man who looked. Tashinori's breath hitched. He saw the green hair. He saw the freckles. He saw the face. His gaze flickered from the boy on the ground to the broken man on his knee. The resemblance was absolute, uncanny, and horrifying. It was like looking at a photograph of his student that had been set on fire, stomped on, and left out in the rain for a decade. A wave of ice-cold dread, colder than any fear he'd felt for his own life, washed over him. He felt a phantom pain in his side, a visceral, empathetic agony. Aizawa's eyes narrowed, his analytical mind working at lightning speed. The energy signature had been off the charts, unlike any quirk he'd ever encountered. The intruder was heavily armed, clearly a seasoned fighter. And for some reason, he looked exactly like a battle-ravaged version of his most problematic, self-sacrificing student. His grip on his capture weapon tightened. This was a threat of an unknown magnitude. "Who are you?" Aizawa demanded, his voice low and dangerous, his glowing red gaze fixed solely on the stranger. He was canceling the man's quirk, or at least he hoped he was. The future Izuku, this broken specter they would come to call Deku, didn't even flinch under the hero's glare. He slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet, his full, intimidating height becoming apparent. He towered over his younger self, a dark monolith of past pains and future sorrows. He looked from Aizawa's hostile stance to All Might's horrified face. A bitter, mirthless smile touched his scarred lips. "He's not going to believe me," the man rasped, his words directed not at the teachers, but at the boy on the ground. "He never does." He raised his one good hand, a gesture of weary surrender, but his eyes never left All Might's. In that gaze, Tashinori saw a universe of shared history he didn't recognize, a deep and sorrowful connection that made his blood run cold. It was the look of a student who had watched his master die. Young Izuku was trapped in the crossfire, a deer in the headlights of his own oncoming destiny. His gaze flickered between the two people he trusted most in the world and the impossible man who wore his face. His heart pounded a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. The cool night air felt suffocating, the silence fraught with 1,000 unasked questions and one terrifying, unspoken truth. The future had come to find him, and it was bleeding on the lawn of Yue High. The room was aggressively, antiseptically white. The walls were bare, the floor was polished linoleum, and the air hummed with the low, monotonous drone of an industrial ventilation system. A single, long steel table bisected the space, its surface cold and unforgiving under the flat, shadowless glare of recessed fluorescent lights. It was one of Yue's many secure interrogation rooms, a place designed to strip away comfort and pretense, leaving only the cold, hard truth. Or more often cold, hard lies. At the center of it all sat the specter. His name was Izuku Midoriya, he'd said. And he wore the name like a shroud. He was seated in a reinforced chair, his one good hand resting flat on the table's surface. His prosthetic arm lay limp at his side, its internal mechanism silent. On his wrists were a pair of bulky, state-of-the-art quirk-suppressing cuffs, glowing with a soft blue light. A precaution, Aizawa had insisted, his voice leaving no room for argument. The man hadn't fought them. He had submitted with a weariness that was somehow more unnerving than any resistance would have been. Across the table, Principal Niza sat primly in a specially sized chair, his paws steepled before him, his black, beady eyes gleaming with an intelligence that was both brilliant and deeply unsettling. To his right stood Shota Aizawa, a pillar of exhausted vigilance. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his capture weapon draped loosely around his neck. His gaze never left the stranger, his own quirk held in readiness, a promise of instant nullification. To Nisa's left, Toshinori Yagi sat hunched and gaunt, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. He couldn't stop staring at the man, at the scarred face, the deadened eyes, the metal arm, and seeing a grotesque reflection of his own failures. Every scar on that man's body felt like a personal accusation. He had handed a boy a godlike power and a crushing burden, and this broken soldier was the result. The guilt was a physical thing, a shard of ice lodged deep in his chest. And in the corner of the room, sitting on a simple chair placed almost as an afterthought, was Izuku Midoriya. He was a silent, stunned observer in a drama that was fundamentally his own. The world had narrowed to the four walls of this room, to the impossible man who wore his face. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a profound, chilling numbness. It was a defense mechanism, his mind refusing to fully process the implications of what he was seeing. He found his eyes tracing the jagged scar on the man's cheek, the thin white line across his lips, the terrifyingly lifeless gleam of the prosthetic that was where his own right arm currently rested, safe and whole, in his lap. He kept flexing his fingers, just to reassure himself they were still there. Still his. The phrase echoed in the ringing silence of his mind, a relentless, pounding mantra. My name is Izuku Midoriya. And I failed. It was Nizu who finally broke the silence, his voice as calm and precise as a scalpel. Let us begin with the most pressing question, if you would. You claim to be Izuku Midoriya, from a future timeline. Assuming for a moment that we accept this extraordinary premise, how did you get here? The man, the future Izuku, the walking failure, didn't look at Nizu. His gaze remained fixed on the sterile tabletop. When he spoke, his voice was a low rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together. A device, he said, his tone devoid of inflection. A temporal displacement unit. It was a one-of-a-kind prototype. A Hail Mary? A time machine? Aizawa scoffed, his skepticism dripping from the words. That's the story you're going with? Science fiction? The man's head tilted slightly, a flicker of some dark, long-buried emotion in his eyes. When you can punch the weather, fly, or talk to animals, science fiction becomes a pretty flexible term, don't you think, Eraserhead? He knew Aizawa's hero name. Of course he did. The familiarity was another small, unsettling cut. He continued before Aizawa could retort. It wasn't a machine in the way you're thinking. Not a neat little box with buttons and levers. It was a focusing array, designed by a friend. For the briefest of moments, a shadow of pain crossed his features, so fleeting Izuku almost missed it. It needed a power source. A specific kind. We found one. A girl, no older than he is, he said, nodding almost imperceptibly toward young Izuku in the corner. Her quirk was unravel. She could perceive and slightly influence temporal threads. She was dying. The quirk was tearing her apart from the inside. We used the array to channel the energy of her final moments. It ripped a hole. I went through. A chilling silence followed the explanation. Toshinori looked ill. The idea of harnessing a dying child's power, even voluntarily, was monstrous. So this was a one-way trip, Nisa concluded, his expression unreadable. You cannot return. There's nothing to return to, the man stated flatly. The finality in those words was absolute. Aizawa pushed himself off the wall. All right, I've had enough of the fantasy novel. You're an intruder on Yue grounds, possessing an unregistered and highly dangerous power. You look like one of my students, which makes you a massive security risk. So you can either start giving us some verifiable facts, or your story is going to end in a Tartarus holding cell. The man finally lifted his head, his dead green eyes meeting Aizawa's glowing red ones. There was no fear in his gaze. No defiance. Only a vast, empty expanse of weariness. Facts, he repeated, the word tasting like ash. You want facts? He took a slow, rattling breath. In 2 months, you will lead a raid on the Shai Hasaikai compound. The mission will be to rescue a little girl named Eri. You will succeed, But Sir Knight I will die. Mirio Togata will lose his quirk. Tashinori gasped. Izuku felt a jolt, as if he'd been electrocuted. Sir Knight I? All Might's former sidekick? The one he was supposed to be interning with? Aizawa's expression tightened. The information was too specific, too plausible. The name Eri had come up in preliminary intelligence briefings, but it was highly classified. In about a year from now, the man continued, his voice a relentless, morbid cadence, the Paranormal Liberation Front, an army of over 100,000 villains led by Tamura Shigaraki, will declare war on Heroes Society. A war we will win. At a cost. His gaze shifted, landing squarely on Tashinori. Shigaraki's body will be perfected by Dr. Garaki, granting him all for one. He will hunt down one for all. He will almost succeed. During the fight, he will kill Katsuki Bakugo right in front of my eyes. The name hit young Izuku like a physical blow. He shot upright in his chair, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. Kaken? Dead? No. No, it was impossible. It was a lie. It had to be. Kaken was. Kaken. He was victory incarnate. He didn't lose. He didn't die. No, Izuku whispered, the words stolen from his lungs. The future man's eyes met his, and for the first time, Izuku saw not emptiness, but a deep, shared agony. Yes, he said softly, and the simple affirmation was more devastating than any shout. He died to save my life. Just like you always feared he would. Tashinori put a hand to his mouth, his own memories of Bakugo's reckless sacrifice at Kamino, throwing himself in front of Izuku, flashing in his mind. The thought that it was a prelude to his death was unbearable. The man turned his gaze back to the table, his narrative voice becoming cold and detached again, a historian recounting a tragedy he had long since memorized. That war broke us. Not because we lost, but because we won. The public saw the devastation, the sheer power unleashed. They saw heroes who looked more like monsters than saviors. They saw a symbol of peace who couldn't prevent cities from burning. Trust in the hero system, already fragile after All Might's retirement, shattered completely. He gestured vaguely with his flesh and blood hand. Heroes were hunted in the streets. Vigilantes became the norm. The government collapsed. Japan became a patchwork of walled cities and lawless territories. We spent years fighting, trying to hold the pieces together. Class 1A, we became soldiers. We lost people. Kirishima. Yaoyorozu. Ochako. He choked on the last name, his composure finally cracking. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his scarred cheek jumped. Izuku felt a new wave of nausea. Yaoyorozu's brilliant smile. Kirishima's bright, toothy grin. Ochako's warm, bubbly laugh. Gone. All gone. He was in a waking nightmare. We thought Shigaraki was the final boss, the man continued, forcing the words out. We were wrong. He was just a cataclysm. The real monster came from the ashes. He looked up, his eyes now burning with a cold, terrifying fire. He called himself Oblivion. We never even learned his real name. He wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He didn't want power or money or revenge. He was a philosopher. A zealot. He believed that quirks were a cosmic mistake. A plague upon humanity that promised only an endless cycle of chaos, conflict, and destruction. He looked at our world, at the rubble and the graveyards we had made, and he saw proof that he was right. And his goal? Nisa asked quietly, his usual cheerful demeanor completely gone. The complete and total eradication of every quirk on the planet, the man said. He called it the Great Reset. A return to the baseline. To a humanity free from the curse of power. That's impossible, Aizawa stated. No quirk is that powerful. It wasn't a quirk, the man corrected him. It was science. Oblivion was a genius, the likes of which the world had never seen. He didn't try to fight us on our terms. He didn't use brute force. He created a technology, a nanomachine virus that could rewrite genetic code on a global scale. It would target and neutralize the quirk factor in every living human. Permanently, he planned to release it into the stratosphere. He would have turned us all into normal people. Izuku felt a strange, heretical thought surface. A world without quirks. A world where he would have just been normal. Like he was always supposed to be. But the thought was instantly followed by horror. A world without All Might's smile. Without Ida's engine legs or Uraraka's gentle touch? It would be a gray, colorless world. We fought him, the future Izuku said, his voice dropping low. His technology was designed to counter quirks. To nullify them, to turn them against the user. He had drones that could analyze and replicate weaknesses in seconds. He had shields that could absorb kinetic energy. Fighting him was like punching a ghost. One for all, even at 100%, it was like throwing rocks at a fortress. I was the symbol of peace, the most powerful man on the planet, and I was losing. He held up his right arm. The prosthetic one. This, he said, his voice flat, was from the first time we fought. He didn't beat me with strength. He beat me with logic. He deployed a frequency that caused the energy of one for all to overload in my limb. The muscle and bone liquefied. They had to amputate at the shoulder to save my life. Tashinori made a choked, strangled sound. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. So how did you win? Nisa asked, leaning forward, his analytical mind captivated by the apocalyptic problem. The man's face became a mask of pure tragedy. I did what I had to do. I pushed one for all past its breaking point. I did something I swore I would never do. The vestiges, they agreed. It was the only way. He looked at young Izuku, his expression full of a terrible, sorrowful pity. I used one for all not as a shield to protect, but as a sword to destroy. I killed him. I leveled a city to do it, but I killed him. He slumped in his chair, the story finally draining the last of his energy. I won. And I stood there, in the ruins of the last city, the sky choked with dust. And there was silence. No one to cheer, no one left to save. The world was saved, but it was an empty, broken husk. Hero society was a memory. Most of my friends were dead. The man who called himself Deku, the hero who would save everyone with a smile, he died that day. All that was left was me. He looked around the pristine white room, at the three authority figures and the terrified boy in the corner. I am the ghost of a Pyrrhic victory. A monument to failure. I saved an empty house by burning it to the ground. The room was utterly silent, save for Izuku's ragged, shallow breathing. The story was too immense, too horrifying to be a lie. The pain in the man's voice, the haunted abyss in his eyes, that couldn't be faked. This was the truth. This was a truth. A possible one. It was Tashinori who spoke first, his voice trembling with a grief that was both for the man before him and the boy in the corner. Why? Why are you here, my boy? He whispered, the paternal terms slipping out. The man's hard expression softened for a fraction of a second at the name. To stop it from ever happening, he said. All of it. Oblivion wasn't born in the war. He was forged by a single event, long before. A nexus event, Melissa called it. A moment in time where a single action, or inaction, set him on his path. A fork in the road of history. Melissa? Tashinori asked, latching on to the familiar name. Melissa Shield? Yes. She survived. She became the greatest scientific mind of our generation. She's the one who built my arm. She's the one who found the Nexus event. And she's the one who built the device that sent me here. He looked at Tashinori, a deep, painful respect in his eyes. She said she owed it to you? And to me. So you're here to prevent this. Nexus event, Aizawa stated, cutting through the emotion. His voice was still skeptical, but it was now tinged with a grudging seriousness. The stakes, if this man were telling the truth, were astronomical. What is it? I'll tell you when you need to know, the man replied curtly. For now, all you need to know is that my mission has two parts. First, we stop the Nexus event. Second, he turned his full attention to the boy in the corner, his gaze intense and heavy. Young Izuku flinched, feeling as though he were being physically pinned to his chair. Second, the man said, his voice dropping to a low, serious growl, I'm here to train him. To make him better than I was. Stronger. Faster. More efficient. I spent years fumbling with one for all, breaking my bones, holding back. I was afraid of the power. That fear, that hesitation, is what cost us so much. I won't let him make the same mistakes. I will teach him how to unlock One for All's true potential. How to master it. Now. Not in 5 years when it's too late. And how do you plan on doing that? Aizawa asked, his eyes narrowing. His body can barely handle 8%. By breaking it, the man said without a hint of irony. Over and over. I'll push him until his bones snap, and then Recovery Girl will heal him, and I'll push him again. I'll teach him how to analyze, how to prioritize, how to be surgical. I'll strip away the reckless sentimentality, and forge a weapon capable of facing what's coming. A weapon? Toshinori repeated, horrified. Young Midoriya is not a weapon. He is a hero. I taught him to save people, to be a symbol that inspires hope, not a tool of destruction. The man let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. And look where your lessons got me. He shot back, his voice rising for the first time, crackling with a decade of repressed fury and grief. He slammed his prosthetic hand on the table, the sound of metal on metal ringing through the room like a gunshot. Look at me. I tried to save everyone. I tried to smile while my friends were dying. I held on to your ideals like a prayer, and all they did was get more people killed. He stood up, the quirks suppressing cuffs straining. The raw, powerful presence he radiated, even without a quirk, made Aizawa and Toshinori flinch. Hope is a luxury we can't afford. A smile doesn't stop a bullet. My sentimentality, the weakness you nurtured in me, is what led to the world I came from. This time, it will be different. This Izuku Midoriya will not be a symbol, he will be a shield. A sword. He will be what he needs to be to win. Not just the battle, but the whole damn war. His furious, desperate gaze fell on his younger self. Izuku shrank back, his heart hammering. He was looking at the end product of that philosophy. A man so broken he saw salvation only in becoming more broken. A man who wanted to take Izuku's idealism, the very core of his being, and burn it out of him. I don't want to be you, Izuku whispered, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. They were quiet, almost inaudible, but in the tense silence of the room, they landed like a bomb. The man froze. The anger draining from his face, replaced by that familiar, soul-deep agony. He stared at his younger self, at the wide, terrified, but resolute eyes. He looked like a man who had just been stabbed. I know, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He sank back into his chair, the fight gone from him. No one would. The room fell into a heavy, contemplative silence. The raw emotion had been laid bare, the stakes presented in all their horrifying glory. Aizawa, Toshinori, and Niza exchanged a long, meaningful look. Aizawa's expression was hard, set against the idea. Toshinori looked lost, torn between protecting his successor's body and soul and preventing the apocalyptic future he just heard described. It was Niza who made the final decision. His beady eyes were fixed on the future Izuku, analyzing, calculating, weighing the impossible risks. The potential threat of oblivion, as you call him, is too significant to ignore, the principal said, his voice cutting through the tension. Your knowledge, however unpalatable its source, represents a strategic asset we cannot afford to dismiss out of hand. Conversely, your presence here is a gross violation of causality and a security nightmare of the highest order. He took a thoughtful sip from a teacup that hadn't been there a moment ago. Therefore, we will proceed with a compromise. You will be placed under strict parole. You will be housed here at UA, where you can be monitored at all times. Aizawa will be your direct handler. You will not interact with any student, aside from young Midoriya, without explicit permission. You will share all relevant tactical information regarding future threats. Niza set his teacup down with a soft click. And you will be permitted to oversee young Midoriya's training. Principal. Aizawa and Toshinori exclaimed in unison. On the condition, Niza continued, raising a paw to silence them, that either Mr. Aizawa or All Might are present for every single session. Any training method deemed excessively dangerous or psychologically damaging will be vetoed. We are not in the business of creating child soldiers, regardless of the future you come from. We are in the business of nurturing heroes. We will take your knowledge, your efficiency, but we will not sacrifice his heart to do so. Is that understood? The man, Deku, looked from Niza to Aizawa to All Might. He knew it was the best deal he was going to get. He had expected to be thrown in a cell. This was a victory, however compromised. He gave a slow, curt nod. Understood. Good, Niza said, a grim sort of satisfaction in his tone. Then I suppose we have a new consultant on staff. Aizawa looked furious. Tashinori looked sick with worry, but it was Izuku who felt the true weight of the decision. He was trapped. He looked at the man who was his future, this ghost forged by grief and failure. This was his new mentor. This was the man who was going to break him, body and soul, in the name of saving him. He looked down at his own trembling hands, the scars pale against his skin. He had always been willing to break his body to be a hero. He had never considered what would happen if someone tried to break his spirit, too, and for the first time, Izuku Midoriya was truly, deeply afraid of the hero he was trying to become. The sun was a hesitant smear of orange and pink on the eastern horizon, painting the steel skeletons of training ground Gamma in long, distorted shadows. The air was cold enough to bite, carrying the metallic tang of old machinery and damp concrete. For most of UA, it was still the quiet hour before dawn, a time for sleep and dreams. For Izuku Midoriya, it was the first circle of hell. Again, the word was flat, hard, and devoid of encouragement. It was a command, not a request. It came from the dark figure standing motionless atop a stack of shipping containers, a silhouette against the nascent dawn. Deku. Izuku's lungs burned. His legs felt like lead pipes filled with angry wasps. He was already drenched in sweat, his gray Yui training uniform clinging uncomfortably to his skin. For the past hour, he had been running drills. Not the structured, safety-conscious exercises Aizawa put them through, but a brutal, relentless gauntlet of Deku's own design. He'd been dodging surprise attacks from repurposed training bots, leaping across treacherous gaps between rooftops, and practicing his shoot-style kicks against reinforced steel plates. And it was never good enough. Your takeoff was sloppy, Deku's gravelly voice echoed across the industrial park. You lost momentum. That's a quarter second wasted. In a real fight, a quarter second is the difference between a near miss and a hole in your chest. Do it again. Izuku gritted his teeth, forcing down the protest that rose in his throat. He crouched, drawing on One for All. The familiar green lightning of full cowl at 8% wrapped around him, a comforting hum of power he had worked so hard to control. He channeled it into his legs, leaped from the edge of a 3-story platform, twisted in midair to avoid a simulated sniper blast from a hidden bot, and landed on a narrow beam 30 feet away. He landed perfectly, his form exactly as All Might had taught him. He felt a small spark of pride. Inefficient, Deku's voice cut through the air, extinguishing the spark instantly. He was suddenly there, right behind Izuku, having moved from his perch with a speed so silent and fluid it was supernatural. Izuku flinched, startled by his proximity. You used a full-body pivot for a minor course correction. All you needed was to angle your ankle by 3 degrees. You're leaking energy. You're wasting movement. You're thinking like a brawler, not a surgeon. Izuku stared at him, panting. I made it. Making it isn't the goal, Deku snapped, his scarred face a mask of grim impatience. Winning is the goal. And winning means being better, faster, and smarter than your opponent at every conceivable turn. Your 8% is stable. Congratulations. It's also useless against what's coming. It's a child safety blanket. You need more. Standing a safe distance away, near the entrance of the training ground, Tashinori Yagi watched, his hands clenched into tight fists. He was fulfilling Niza's condition, a silent, worried chaperone to this brutal education. Every cold critique from the older Izuku felt like a whip cracking against his own soul. He had taught the boy to be careful, to cherish his body, to grow into the power. This man was teaching him to treat his body like a disposable tool. He's pushing himself, can't you see that? Tashinori called out, his voice thin in the vast space. He needs to rest. Deku didn't even turn to look at him. His deadened green eyes were locked on his younger self. The enemy doesn't rest, he said, the words hanging like icicles in the air. Now. Up the output. 10%. Izuku's eyes widened. 10%? But my control at that level it's not stable. My bones will ache. Deku finished for him, his tone dismissive. Pain is a data point. It tells you where your limit is. Your job isn't to respect that limit. It's to smash through it. Recovery Girl is on standby, a luxury I never had. Don't waste it. He pointed to a towering smokestack at the far end of the training ground, nearly half a mile away. You have 60 seconds to get to the top of that smokestack. 10%. Full cowl. Go. Izuku hesitated, the warning sirens going off in his head. 10% wasn't just a number. It was a threshold. At 8%, the power felt like a strong river current he could guide. Anything higher, and it became a raging flood, threatening to burst its banks. He could feel the latent energy thrumming under his skin, eager and volatile. 58 seconds, Deku said coldly. The fear of failure warred with the fear of pain. And, as always, the fear of failure won. Right. Izuku yelled, more to convince himself than anyone else. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and focused. Imagine the egg in the microwave. Don't let it explode. Spread the energy evenly, but more of it. He pushed the feeling, letting the river of power swell. The green lightning around him intensified, crackling more loudly, the hum rising in pitch. He felt a deep, resonant throb in his muscles, a familiar precursor to pain. The world seemed to sharpen, to brighten. This was 10%. Go! He shot forward. The increase in speed was intoxicating. The ground became a blur beneath his feet. He vaulted over obstacles, his jumps higher, longer. He felt powerful. He felt fast, but it was a sloppy speed. His movements were jerky, his landings heavy. The pain was no longer a dull ache. It was a sharp, stinging protest with every step, every impact. It felt like his muscles were being stretched to their tearing point. He reached the base of the smokestack and began to leap up its side, using pipes and maintenance ladders as handholds. The metal groaned under the force of his landings. He was halfway up when his left foot slipped on a slick patch of rust. His control wavered for a split second. A jolt of raw, untamed power, far more than 10%, surged through his leg. A sickening crack echoed in the morning air, sharp and loud. Izuku cried out, a sharp intake of breath that was pure agony. Blinding, white-hot pain exploded from his ankle. His grip failed, and he fell, tumbling 20 feet before managing to snag a ladder rung with one hand, his body swinging violently and slamming into the cold steel of the smokestack. He hung there, dangling, his left leg useless, the pain so intense it made him dizzy. Pathetic, Deku's voice came from directly above him. He was standing on the very ledge Izuku had been trying to reach, looking down with an expression of profound disappointment. You lost focus. You let the power control you. You think a real villain would give you a second chance after a mistake like that? Toshinori was running, his skeletal form moving with a panicked urgency he hadn't shown since Kamino. Young Midoriya. Are you alright? Stop this. The session is over. Deku ignored him. He leaped down, landing as softly as a cat beside where Izuku was now huddled on the ground, cradling his shattered ankle. Look at me, he commanded. Izuku looked up, his vision blurred with tears of pain and frustration. I tried. Trying isn't enough, Deku said, his voice a low growl. You had the power. You lacked the discipline. The price for that is a broken bone. In the future I'm from, the price for that mistake would have been Ochako Uraraka's life. Do you understand? Your weakness has consequences beyond your own pain. The name, spoken so coldly, so transactionally, was like a slap in the face. Izuku stared at his future self, at the man who spoke of their friend's death as a teachable moment. The pain in his ankle was suddenly secondary to the cold dread filling his chest. The Yui infirmary smelled of antiseptic, clean linens, and the faint, sweet scent of Recovery Girl's quirk. Izuku sat on the edge of a cot, his face pale. His ankle, now healed, still felt tender and phantom sore. Chio Shizenji, the youthful heroine, Recovery Girl, tooted as she finished her examination, her expression a mixture of professional concern and grandmotherly fury. A compound fracture of the tibia and fibula, she said, her voice tight as she glared over her spectacles at the two men standing by the door. This wasn't a training accident. This was deliberate endangerment. You're pushing his body far beyond its natural limits. Deku stood with his arms crossed, his prosthetic gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He looked completely unfazed. His limits are insufficient. They need to be expanded. Through torture? Recovery Girl shot back, her small frame bristling with indignation. This isn't how you build strength. This is how you create trauma. You are depleting his stamina and forcing me to use my quirk on him repeatedly. There's a limit to how much one person can take, physically and mentally. The world I'm from didn't care about my limits, Deku stated, his voice like stone. Healed bones grow back stronger. It's a biological fact. He needs that strength. A broken world, however, stays broken. That's a historical fact. Toshinori stepped forward, placing a placating hand on Recovery Girl's shoulder. He looked exhausted, the skin under his eyes dark with worry. Chio, please. We have an agreement. I was there. I'm watching him. Watching him? She scoffed, turning her ire on him. You're letting this stranger break him. Look at the boy, Toshinori. That's not the look of determination. That's fear. You, of all people, should know the difference. Izuku remained silent through it all. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, the subject of a heated debate he had no voice in. He stared at his newly healed ankle, flexing it. It felt fine. Physically, but Recovery Girl was right. He was afraid. He was afraid of the pain, of failing, but most of all, he was afraid of the cold, dead-eyed man who was orchestrating it all. The man who was him. Deku pushed himself off the wall. Are we done here? We're wasting daylight. He needs to recover. Recovery Girl insisted. He's healed, Deku countered. That's recovered enough. Get dressed, he said to Izuku, his gaze leaving no room for argument. We're not finished. As Izuku slowly pulled his socks and shoes back on, his hands trembling slightly, Toshinori pulled Deku aside, his voice a low, desperate whisper. My boy, please. You have to ease up. This isn't the way. You'll break his spirit. Deku's eyes, for a moment, lost their hardness and filled with a profound, ancient sadness. His spirit, he said quietly, is a luxury. It's a beautiful, wonderful luxury that I couldn't afford. I'm trying to make sure he never has to pay the price I did. He turned and walked out of the infirmary without a backward glance, leaving Toshinori standing there, heartbroken, and Izuku to follow, feeling like a condemned man walking to his own execution. The afternoon sun was high and harsh, beating down on the concrete and steel of ground gamma. The heat radiated upwards in shimmering waves. The brief, painful respite in the infirmary felt like a distant memory. Deku had set up a new scenario. In the center of a mock city square, a single, heavy-duty training bot stood inert. It was painted a menacing black and red. A large, flashing red light on its chest pulsed like a malevolent heart. Beside it, a large section of scaffolding and heavy steel pipes had been arranged to look like a collapsed structure. Pinned underneath the wreckage was a life-size civilian dummy, its plastic face frozen in a neutral expression. All right, Deku began, his voice all business. Here is the situation. That bot is a high-yield incendiary device, set to detonate in 90 seconds. Its blast radius will incinerate this entire city block. He gestured to the surrounding buildings. Your objective is to neutralize the threat. Disable the bot before it detonates. Izuku nodded, his mind already racing. 90 seconds. He could do that. One complication, Deku added, pointing to the dummy. There is a civilian trapped in the debris field, 20 feet from the blast's epicenter. The structure is unstable. Moving the debris to free him will take time and precise application of force. Izuku's eyes flickered between the bot and the dummy. He immediately understood. So I have to. You have a choice, Deku stated, his face impassive. You can go directly for the bot, ensuring you neutralize the primary threat well within the time limit. Or you can attempt to rescue the civilian first, which will eat up precious seconds and dramatically decrease your chance of stopping the bomb in time. You cannot do both. Not in 90 seconds. Not at your current level. Izuku stared at the setup, his heart beginning to pound. It was a test. Not of his power, but of his ideology. A hero's calculus. It's a dummy, Izuku said, needing to confirm. Today, it's a dummy, Deku said, his voice dropping. Tomorrow, it's a mother of 3. A promising student. A good man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The choice is the same. The timer starts on your first move. Begin. Izuku stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the hypothetical choice pressing down on him. Tashinori watched from the sidelines, his face etched with anxiety. He knew what choice his successor would make. He had raised him to make it. Izuku took a breath and exploded into motion. He didn't go for the bot. He never would. A hero saves people. The core principle of his being screamed at him. The bot was a problem to be solved, but the person, the trapped, helpless person, was the priority. He activated full cow, pushing it back to a shaky 9%, the pain a low thrum under his skin. He reached the collapsed structure in seconds. "I'm here," he yelled, the force of habit making him shout to the inanimate dummy. "I'll get you out." The pipes were heavy, tangled together in a precarious mess. He couldn't just smash them. That might crush the dummy further. He needed to be careful. He wedged his fingers under a massive steel beam, his muscles screaming as he channeled one for all into his arms. Detroit. Smash! He roared, but he modulated the power, pulling his punch at the last second. It wasn't a destructive blow, but a kinetic lift. The beam groaned and shifted upwards just enough for him to kick it aside. 30 seconds left, a cold, computerized voice announced from hidden speakers. His heart leaped into his throat. 30 seconds? He'd only moved one piece of debris. He worked faster, his movements becoming more frantic. He threw another pipe aside, then another. The dummy was almost clear. He just needed to move one last, twisted sheet of metal. 15 seconds left. He gritted his teeth, grabbed the final piece, and wrenched it free. The dummy was clear. He could grab it and leap away. No. That wasn't the mission. He had to stop the bot. He spun around, his eyes locking on the red and black machine. The light on its chest was flashing frantically, a rapid, urgent pulse. He had seconds. He crouched, channeling every ounce of the 9% he could muster into his legs. 10 seconds. He launched himself across the square, a green blur of desperation. 5, 4, 3, he was almost there. He drew back his leg for a Manchester smash. 2, 1, a deafening, klaxon-like buzzer blared through the training ground, signifying detonation. Izuku skidded to a halt a few feet from the bot, whose light had gone dark. He had failed. He stood there, panting, his body trembling with adrenaline and exertion. He looked from the inert bot to the saved dummy, a sick feeling roiling in his stomach. He had saved the person, but he had lost the city. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind him. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. "You failed the objective," Deku said. There was no anger in his voice. Just a flat, dead finality. "I saved him." Izuku whipped around, his voice cracking with emotion. He pointed a trembling finger at the dummy. "I got the civilian out. That's what matters. A hero saves people." "You saved one person," Deku corrected him, his expression like granite. "And in doing so, you allowed the incendiary device to detonate. You condemned the hypothetical hundreds of others in the surrounding buildings to death. You traded a crowd for an individual. That is a failed mission. But, there are no buts." Deku's voice rose, the cold facade cracking to reveal the furnace of bitter experience beneath. "There are only consequences. Out in the field, you don't get points for trying. You don't get a gold star for good intentions. You get a body count. You made a sentimental choice, not a strategic one. It's the right choice." Izuku yelled back, tears of frustration welling in his eyes. "Saving people is always the right choice. That's what being a hero is." "No!" Deku took a step forward, his shadow falling over Izuku. He was radiating an aura of pure, chilling authority born from unimaginable loss. Being a hero is about creating the best possible outcome with the shitty options you're given. Sometimes that means making a choice that feels wrong. Sometimes you have to make a sacrifice. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that cut deeper than any shout. Sometimes you have to make a choice. You can't save everyone. The mission comes first. The words struck Izuku with the force of a physical blow. They were the antithesis of everything he believed in, everything All Might had ever taught him. They were the words of a soldier, a general, not a hero. No, Izuku whispered, shaking his head in denial. A hero who stops trying to save everyone, who decides who is worth saving and who isn't. They aren't a hero at all. What's the point of winning if we lose that? If we lose ourselves? He looked past Deku at Toshinori, who stood frozen, his face a mask of conflict and sorrow. All Might smiled. He smiled to save people's hearts, even when things were scary. He was telling us that everything would be okay. That's the point. For a long moment, Deku just stared at him. The fire in his eyes died down, replaced by that familiar, vast emptiness. He looked tired. So incredibly tired. He slowly lifted his right hand, the prosthetic one, the chrome and carbon fiber catching the harsh afternoon light. The point is survival, he said, his voice now quiet and hoarse. The point is having a world left to have ideals in. He flexed the metallic fingers, the micro-servos whirring softly. My ideals died with my friends. They died with my arm. They died in cities of ash and bone. I'm trying to make sure yours don't cost you the same. He turned and walked away, leaving Izuku standing alone in the center of the silent, simulated city square. The training session was over. Izuku was bruised, his ankle throbbed, his muscles felt like they'd been put through a meat grinder. But none of that mattered. The physical pain was a dull, distant noise compared to the screaming void that had just been ripped open inside his soul. He had looked at his future self, expecting to see a stronger, more confident hero. A pillar to aspire to. But he didn't see a hero. He saw a monster forged by grief, a man hollowed out and filled with cold, hard math. A man who would leave someone to die for the greater good. He stumbled back towards the dorms, ignoring Toshinori's hesitant calls. He needed to be alone. He walked into Heights Alliance, the familiar warmth and faint smell of bakugos cooking from the night before doing nothing to comfort him. He trudged up to his room, his feet dragging. He closed the door, shutting out the world. His room, his sanctuary, was a shrine to All Might. Posters of the smiling hero adorned every wall. Figurines stood proudly on his shelves. It had always been his source of inspiration. Now, as he looked at the brilliant, unwavering smile, it felt naive. A beautiful lie from a simpler time. He walked to the mirror and stared at his reflection. His own wide green eyes, still wet with unshed tears, stared back. He looked young. He looked weak, and for a terrifying, gut-wrenching second, the image wavered. He saw his face harden, a scar bloom across his cheek, his eyes sink and grow cold, his right arm flicker into chrome and steel. He saw the ghost. He saw Deku. A choked sob escaped his lips, and he slapped his hands against the mirror, as if to push the apparition away. I don't want to become him, the thought screamed in his mind, sharp and clear. I don't want that future. I don't want to be that person. The fear was no longer about whether he was worthy of one for all. It was no longer about whether he could live up to All Might's legacy. A new, far more terrible fear had taken root. What if, in his desperate quest to become the world's greatest hero, he succeeded, only to become a monster? The common room of Heights Alliance was supposed to be a sanctuary. After the chaos of Kamino and the sudden, jarring transition to dorm life, this shared space had become the heart of Class 1A. It was a place of boisterous movie nights, heated study sessions, and the quiet, easy camaraderie of teenagers who had stared into the abyss together and come out the other side. It hummed with the comforting energy of life, a constant, low-level thrum of chatter, music, and the occasional explosion from the kitchen. But lately, a discordant note had crept into the harmony. A thread of unease, woven around one of their own. Izuku Midoriya had become a ghost in his own home. It had been a week since the stranger's arrival. A week since Izuku had been assigned a new, brutally demanding private tutor to accelerate his control over his quirk. The official story, delivered by Aizawa with his usual deadpan finality, was that a specialist from Island had been brought in as a consultant. His name was Kurayami, and his methods were unorthodox. No one was to interfere. But Class 1A were not fools. They were training to be heroes, and a hero's first skill is observation. And what they observed was deeply unsettling. They saw Izuku disappearing before dawn every morning, dragging himself out of the dorms while the sky was still a bruised purple. They saw him returning hours later, long after classes had ended for the day, moving with the stiff, pained gait of an old man. He was always covered in a fresh constellation of bruises that peeked out from the collar and cuffs of his uniform. The faint scent of antiseptic clung to him, a constant reminder of his frequent, mandatory trips to Recovery Girl's office. He ate his meals quickly, his gaze distant, his shoulders perpetually slumped under an invisible weight. He'd politely decline invitations to join in on video games or group study, murmuring apologies about being too tired or needing to review his training notes. He would retreat to his room, and the door would remain shut. The light in his eyes, the brilliant, earnest fire that defined him, was dimming. It was being systematically snuffed out, ember by painful ember. The whispers started in the quiet corners of the common room, in the hallways between classes, in worried text messages sent late at night. "Did you see Midoriya-kun today?" Ochako Uraraka asked one evening, her voice a hushed murmur as she sat on the couch with Tsuyu Azuri and Mina Ashido. "He almost fell asleep in his seat during present mixed class. And he has a new cut on his cheek. He's gotten thinner, Karo," Tsuyu added, her finger pressed to her chin in her characteristic thoughtful pose. "And he barely said 2 words at lunch." Mina leaned in, her pink face scrunched with concern. "It's this Kurayami guy, right? What kind of training is he putting Deku-kun through? It seems more like torture. Aizawa-sensei wouldn't let that happen, would he?" No one had a good answer. They trusted their teacher, but the evidence of Izuku's decline was undeniable. Tenya Ida, chopping vegetables in the kitchen with an almost violent precision, overheard them. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, his brow furrowed with a rigid anxiety. As class president, he felt a deep responsibility for the well-being of his classmates. Midoriya's condition was a gross violation of every safety protocol and ethical guideline he held dear. This unregulated training was a source of profound personal and procedural distress. He had tried to talk to Izuku, of course. He had approached him in his usual formal, direct manner. "Midoriya-kun, I must express my grave concerns regarding your new training regimen. Your physical and mental exhaustion are becoming apparent to all. As your friend and class representative, I must insist you disclose the nature of this training so we can ensure it adheres to UA's safety standards." Izuku had just flinched, his eyes wide and haunted. It's fine, Ida-kun," he had stammered, avoiding his friend's intense gaze. It's what I have to do. Please don't worry." He had then quickly excused himself, leaving Ida standing in the hallway, his hand outstretched, feeling utterly helpless. Shoto Todoroki was quieter in his observations, but no less perceptive. He watched Izuku from a distance, his mismatched eyes seeing something painfully familiar in his friend's withdrawn posture, and the haunted look he tried so desperately to hide. He recognized the look of someone being systematically broken down, someone being pushed to a breaking point by a figure of overwhelming authority. He had seen that look in his own mirror for years. The ghost of his father's training lingered in his mind, and he saw its cruel echo in Izuku's suffering. He didn't know who this Kurayami was, but he knew the type. But the most perceptive, and by far the most confrontational, was Katsuki Bakugo. Bakugo noticed everything. He had spent his entire life with Izuku Midoriya as a constant, annoying, yet oddly integral part of his existence. He knew the nerd's every tick, every tell. He knew the difference between Izuku's determined face and his scared but pretending not to be face. And for the past week, Izuku had been wearing the latter like a permanent mask. He saw the exhaustion that Izuku tried to hide behind a fragile smile. He saw the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. He heard the muffled thuds and occasional pained gasps from Izuku's room late at night, the sound of someone pushing their broken body through yet another set of exercises. And it pissed him off. It was an incoherent rage, a tangled knot of emotions he couldn't and wouldn't bother to untangle. It was partly the infuriating secrecy. It was partly the gall of some extra, some nobody consultant, thinking they had the right to train Deku. That was his job. He was the one who pushed Deku. He was Deku's rival, the benchmark, the hurdle that forced the damn nerd to get stronger. This Kurayami was an intruder, a usurper. But beneath the anger, buried deep down, was something else. Something that tasted unnervingly like concern. He had just started to see Deku as a true rival, someone who stood on his own 2 feet. After their fight, after learning the truth about One for All, their dynamic had shifted. It was no longer just a one-sided antagonism. It was a complex, fragile rivalry built on a shared secret with All Might. And now, someone was taking that burgeoning strength, that newfound confidence, and grinding it into dust. Bakugo had wanted to break Deku's spirit for years, but seeing someone else actually do it felt wrong. It felt like watching someone vandalize something that was, in a strange and unspoken way, his. His simmering anger finally boiled over one evening. Izuku was stumbling through the common room, heading for the stairs, his gym bag slung over a shoulder that was clearly aching. He was soaked in sweat, a fresh scrape marred his jawline, and he was limping, trying his best to hide it. "Oh, Deku!" Bakugo's voice was a low growl from the kitchen, where he was pointedly sharpening a set of cooking knives. The sound of steel scraping against stone was grating and deliberate. Izuku flinched, stopping in his tracks. "Hey, Kaken." Bakugo didn't look up from his task. "You look like shit." "I'm just tired," Izuku mumbled, starting to move towards the stairs again. "Long day. Don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you, you damn nerd," Bakugo snarled. He slammed the knife down on the counter with a loud clang that made several people jump. He turned, wiping his hands on a towel, and stalked towards Izuku, his red eyes blazing. "Every day it's the same thing," Bakugo said, stopping directly in front of Izuku, forcing the smaller boy to meet his glare. "You crawl back in here looking like you just went 10 rounds with a meat grinder. You think we're all idiots? You think we don't see you falling apart?" Izuku shrank back, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It's just training, Kaken. It's hard, but I have to do it." "Bullshit," Bakugo spat. "I know hard training. Aizawa-sensei runs us into the ground. This is different. This is breaking you. So you're gonna tell me right now, who the hell is this Kurayami guy, and why are you letting him walk all over you?" The confrontation had drawn an audience. Uraraka, Ida, Todoroki, Kurishima, and a few others had stopped what they were doing, watching with a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity. "I can't," Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't tell you," Bakugo's temper flared. "Can't or won't? You think you can handle this alone? Is that it? After everything, you still think you're some solo act who has to carry the whole damn world by yourself?" He jabbed a finger hard into Izuku's chest. "You looked me in the eye and told me about your power because you needed a rival, someone to keep you honest. So what is this? You bringing in some other bastard to do my job for me?" The accusation, twisted as it was by Bakugo's unique brand of aggressive narcissism, hit home. Izuku looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading sorrow. "It's not like that, Kaken. You don't understand. Then make me understand." Bakugo roared, his palms starting to spark, little firecracker pops of explosive frustration. Before Izuku could respond, a new voice, cold as a winter grave, cut through the tension. "That's enough." Every head turned. Standing at the main entrance of the dormitory, partially obscured by shadows, was a tall, imposing figure. He was dressed in simple black tactical pants and a dark gray shirt, but the sheer force of his presence seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. It was Kurayami. It was Deku. This was the first time most of the class had seen him up close. They had caught glimpses of him from a distance, a dark shape moving with unsettling speed on the training grounds. But now, he was here, in their home. And he was terrifying. He was all hard lines and scarred flesh. The prosthetic arm gleamed under the common room lights, a testament to some horrific past battle. But it was his face that stopped them cold. It was the face of a man who had forgotten how to smile. And it was, with chilling, undeniable clarity, Izuku Midoriya's face. Older. Harder. Broken. A collective, silent gasp went through the students who could see him clearly. Mina's hand flew to her mouth. Ida's glasses nearly slid off his nose. Uraraka felt a wave of vertigo, her mind refusing to connect the cheerful, determined boy she knew with the empty-eyed specter at the door. Deku's gaze swept over the stunned students, his expression unreadable. He looked at Bakugo, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of some powerful, ancient emotion crossed his face. Grief, regret, a deep and terrible sorrow. He then looked at Ochako, and the sadness in his eyes deepened into an abyss. His gaze finally settled on his younger self, and it turned to stone. "Your session isn't over," Deku said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with authority. "We're going to the gym." "Now," Bakugo, recovering from his initial shock, bristled. The sheer audacity of this guy, who looked like a funhouse mirror version of Deku, giving orders in his dorm. "And who the hell are you to give him orders?" Bakugo snarled, stepping between Deku and Izuku, a protective, aggressive stance. "He's done for the day." Deku's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, entering the light fully. "You don't get to make that call," Deku said, his voice lethally soft. "You don't know the stakes. You don't know anything. I know I'm looking at a creepy bastard who looks just like Deku and is beating the crap out of him every day," Bakugo shot back, refusing to be intimidated. His palms were glowing now, a clear warning. "So you've got about 5 seconds to start talking or you and me are gonna have a problem." It was the wrong thing to say. In the space of a heartbeat, Deku moved. He wasn't just fast, he transcended speed. He was simply there. One moment he was 10 feet from Bakugo, the next he was invading his personal space, his face inches from the explosive teens. His prosthetic hand shot out, not to strike, but to grip Bakugo's shoulder. The grip was like iron. Bakugo, who prided himself on his strength and reflexes, found himself utterly immobilized. He couldn't move. He couldn't even tense his muscles to resist. The pressure was immense, precise, targeting nerves and pressure points with a surgeon's terrifying knowledge. "A problem?" Deku whispered, and his voice was no longer just weary or sad. It was filled with a cold, terrifying rage, the fury of a man who had lost everything. "You have no idea what a problem I can be, Katsuki Bakugo." The use of his full name, spoken with such a chilling, intimate familiarity, made Bakugo freeze. The power radiating from this man was overwhelming. It wasn't a quirk, Aizawa would have sensed that. It was pure, honed, battle-forged killing intent. It was the presence of a predator that had forgotten it was supposed to be a hero. "Let him go." Todoroki's voice was calm and even, but it cut through the standoff. A thin layer of frost was already creeping across the floor from his right foot, and the air around his left hand was beginning to shimmer with heat. He had moved to flank Deku, his expression one of deadly seriousness. From the other side, Ida had shifted into a running stance, his engines emitting a low, warning hum. "Release our classmate at once. Your actions are unacceptable." Uraraka, her face pale but resolute, had activated her quirk, her fingertips glowing pink. She was ready to make Deku weightless, to throw his balance off, to do something. The core of Class 1A had instinctively formed a united front, standing against the intruder who was threatening one of their own. Deku's gaze flickered to Todoroki, then to Ida and Uraraka. He saw their determination, their loyalty. And for a split second, the rage in his eyes faltered, replaced by that same heartbreaking sorrow. He was looking at ghosts. He was looking at the faces of friends he had buried. The grip on Bakugo's shoulder loosened. Deku took a step back, the suffocating aura of menace receding, though not disappearing entirely. He looked at the circle of defiant teenagers, then at the younger Izuku, who was watching the scene with wide, horrified eyes. "This is what I'm talking about," Deku said, his voice now laced with a bitter irony. He was speaking to his younger self. This. Relying on them. This sentiment. This is the weakness. They can't protect you from what's coming. They'll just die trying. Enough. The voice was a whip crack of command that silenced everyone. Aizawa stood at the top of the stairs, his eyes glowing a furious, brilliant red, his hair floating ethereally around his head. His capture weapon was already lashing out, wrapping around Deku's torso and arms with practiced, binding speed. "Kurayumi. You are in violation of our agreement," Aizawa said, his voice dangerously low. "You were not to interact with other students. and you will not threaten them in my dorms. Deku didn't struggle against the capture weapon. He simply stood there, bound, his gaze fixed on Aizawa. The cold fury had vanished, replaced once more by that infinite, soul-crushing weariness. They interfered, he stated simply. They were protecting their friend from you, Aizawa countered, stalking down the stairs. Something you seem to have forgotten how to do. Your authority in this training exercise is a privilege, not a right. Right now, it is hanging by a thread. He came to a stop in front of Deku, the tension in the room so thick it was hard to breathe. The students watched, frozen. They were seeing a clash of two absolute forces, their unshakable, logical teacher, and the terrifying, broken man who wore their friend's face. Aizawa's red gaze finally broke from Deku to sweep across his students. He saw Bakugo, still rubbing his shoulder, his face a mixture of rage and confusion. He saw Todoroki, still radiating a dangerous heat. He saw Uraraka and Ida, scared but defiant. He saw all of their worried faces turned towards Izuku. And then he looked at Izuku himself, who looked smaller and more lost than ever. The situation was untenable. The secrecy was a cancer, and it was metastasizing. With a flick of his eyes, Aizawa deactivated his quirk. His hair fell, and the capture weapon slackened. He gave Deku one last, warning glare before turning his attention to the rest of the class. Everyone, go to your rooms, he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Midoriya, Bakugo, Todoroki, Ida, Uraraka. You stay. We need to talk. The order was given. The secret was about to break. And as the other students reluctantly dispersed, leaving the chosen few in the tense, silent common room with their teacher and the ghosts from the future, Izuku knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The whispers in the dorms had finally coalesced into a shout, and the fallout was just beginning. The rooftop of Heights Alliance was a place of quiet solitude, a liminal space between the curated safety of the dorms and the vast, stardusted canvas of the night sky. The wind was a low, mournful whisper, carrying the distant, 24-hour hum of Muzurifu. It was a place one came to think, to escape, to feel small under the immensity of the cosmos. It was here that Toshinori Yagi found him. Deku stood at the edge of the roof, his back to the access door. He wasn't admiring the view. His posture was ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on the distant city lights that spread out below like a galaxy of fallen stars. He stood as still as the concrete parapet he leaned against, a statue carved from grief and regret. His prosthetic arm hung limp at his side, but his left hand, his flesh and blood hand, was clenched so tightly that the knuckles were white, bloodless peaks in the dim moonlight. The confrontation in the common room hours earlier had left a deep, ragged wound in the fragile fabric of their arrangement. Aizawa, in a move of calculated desperation, had revealed a carefully redacted version of the truth to the 5 students. They knew Deku was Izuku Midoriya from a ruined future. They knew he was here on a desperate mission to prevent a catastrophe. They didn't know the specifics, the names of the dead, the horror of oblivion, but they knew enough. The revelation had been met with stunned silence, then a torrent of questions, and finally, a grim, reluctant acceptance. The secret was now a shared burden, and the dynamic in the dorm had shifted from worried suspicion to a tense, complicated alliance. Toshinori approached slowly, his slippered feet making almost no sound on the gravelly rooftop surface. He had waited until he was sure the students were settled, until the emotional shockwaves had subsided into an uneasy calm. Now, it was his turn. He needed to understand. He needed to face the man his boy had become. It's a beautiful view, Toshinori said, his voice quiet, careful not to startle the coiled figure. He came to a stop a few feet away, leaning his gaunt frame against the railing. I used to come up here sometimes, when I was a student. It always made the world feel manageable. Deku didn't turn. For a long moment, he didn't even seem to register Toshinori's presence. Then, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that was almost stolen by the wind. Manageable, he repeated, the word a foreign concept, a language he no longer spoke. I don't remember what that feels like. They stood in silence for a while, 2 broken men bound by the same power, staring at the same city but seeing 2 vastly different worlds. Toshinori saw a city of hope, a city he had protected, a city that was now his successor's charge. Deku saw a ghost city. He saw the buildings as they would one day look, skeletal, hollowed-out husks against a perpetually gray sky. He saw phantoms on the streets, heard the echoes of screams that hadn't happened yet. "They're good kids," Toshinori said softly, breaking the silence. They were scared, but they stood up for him. For you. They stood against a force they couldn't comprehend, all for the sake of their friend. "I know," Deku said, and the words were heavy with a sorrow that was bottomless. "That's what they do. That's who they are. It's why so many of them are dead in my time." The statement was delivered with the blunt, unsparing finality of a coroner's report. Toshinori flinched, the casual mention of his student's death sending a fresh shard of ice into his heart. "You said, in the interrogation room, you mentioned young Bakugo," Toshinori began, his voice hesitant, afraid of the answer he was seeking. "You said he died, saving you." Deku's shoulders tensed. The memory was clearly a raw, unhealed nerve. He took a slow, rattling breath. "Shigaraki," he said, the name a curse. "He was faster than I anticipated. His decay quirk had evolved, spreading through contact with the ground. He was coming for me, and I was momentarily trapped. I couldn't dodge." He turned his head slightly, his scarred profile stark against the city lights. "Kaken, he was never the fastest. Not like Ida. But his instincts, they were instantaneous. He didn't even think, he just moved. He pushed me out of the way. He used his AP shot to propel himself, putting his own body between me and Shigaraki. The decay took him in seconds. It started at his feet and just unraveled him." Toshinori closed his eyes, a pained gasp escaping his lips. He could see it. He could see Bakugo's fierce, defiant scowl, even in the face of certain death. He could see the selfless, heroic act that was so contrary to the boy's abrasive personality, yet so fundamentally a part of his core. His last words. Deku's voice cracked. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the memory was seared onto the inside of his eyelids. He looked at me, and he wasn't scared. He was just angry. He yelled, "Don't you dare lose now, you damn nerd." And then he was gone. Just dust. He fell silent, the grief radiating from him in palpable waves. "He spent his whole life trying to prove he was better than me," Deku whispered to the wind. "And in the end, his only thought was making sure I could keep going. That I could win. I won. And he wasn't there to see it." Toshinori felt tears welling in his own sunken eyes. He saw the irony, the beautiful, terrible tragedy of it. The boy who had bullied Izuku for his perceived weakness had made the ultimate sacrifice, fueled by a fierce, undeniable belief in that same boy's strength. And young Uraraka? Toshinori asked, his voice barely audible. He was dreading this, but he had to know. He had to understand the full weight of the ghost his successor carried. Deku's good hand, which had been clenched, suddenly went limp. He seemed to shrink in on himself, the grief turning from a sharp, angry pain to a deep, hollow ache. "Ochako," he said, and her name was a prayer on his lips. "She didn't die in the war. She survived it. We all did, for a while. We tried to build something new from the wreckage. We were." He trailed off, unable to say the word. "Happy? Together?" The concepts were too painful to touch. She was the heart of our new agency. She never lost her hope. Not really. She was the one who kept us all going when the world was ending. She reminded us what we were fighting for. Her smile, it was the last real symbol of peace we had left. He took another shaky breath. It was oblivion. His tactics weren't about direct confrontation. He used terror. He turned the public against the few remaining heroes. He engineered a disaster at a refugee camp, a stampede. Ochako was there, trying to save people, using her quirk to lift debris and make the injured weightless so they could be carried out. His voice grew thick with unshed tears. She was trying to save a little boy trapped under a collapsed wall. She was so focused. She never saw the sniper. One of Oblivion's fanatics, a man whose family had died in the war. A man Oblivion had convinced that quirks were the enemy. He shot her. Right through the chest. She died instantly, her quirk released, and the rubble she was holding up came crashing down. The boy she was trying to save, he died with her, Deku finally turned to face Toshinori fully, and his face was a ruin. The moonlight illuminated the tracks of silent tears carving paths through the grime on his cheeks. I was half a city away, fighting a horde of his drones. I heard it over the comms, he choked out. I heard Ida screaming her name. By the time I got there, it was too late. I held her, and she was just empty. The light was gone. I spent all that time getting stronger, becoming this symbol of power, and I couldn't even save her. I couldn't save the person who mattered most to me. The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. She wasn't just a friend. She was the one. The person he had loved. And he had lost her. Toshinori felt his own scarred, broken body ache with empathetic pain. He had known loss. He had lost his master, Nana Shimura. He had lost his friend, Sir Night Eye. But the scale of this, the sheer, crushing weight of it, it was unimaginable. To lose your rival, your love, your friends, one by one, until you were the only one left standing in the ruins of your world. This is my sin, All Might, Deku said, his voice breaking. He used the old, revered name, not the civilian one. He was speaking not to Toshinori Yagi, but to the symbol of peace, the man whose legacy he had tried and failed to uphold. My deepest failure. Not losing the war, not letting cities fall. My failure was thinking I had to do it alone. I pushed them away. After the war, I became so obsessed with hunting down every last threat, with being the unbreakable pillar, that I isolated myself. I thought if I was strong enough, I wouldn't have to risk them. I thought I could shoulder the entire burden. He gestured with his prosthetic arm, a bitter, self-deprecating motion. I thought I was protecting them by keeping them at a distance. But all I did was make them targets. I became the focal point, and they became collateral damage in a war against me. My desire to save everyone, to be everything for everyone, is the very thing that doomed them. It wasn't my weakness that got them killed. It was my strength. Or what I thought was strength. He looked at Toshinori, his eyes pleading, begging for an absolution he knew he didn't deserve. Do you see now? Why he gestured vaguely downwards, towards the dorm where his younger self was sleeping, can't be me. His heart is still pure. He still believes in teamwork. He still believes in trust. I came back here to train him, to make him stronger, but I've been doing it all wrong. I've been trying to forge him into the same broken weapon I became. I've been teaching him my sins. The confession was complete. The ghost had finally shown his deepest wounds, and Toshinori, looking at the desolate, shattered man who was once his bright, hopeful boy, felt not pity, but a profound, gut-wrenching guilt. He, Toshinori Yagi, was the architect of this pain. No, my boy, Toshinori said, his voice thick with emotion as he stepped forward and, with a trembling hand, placed it on Deku's flesh and blood shoulder. The man flinched at the contact but didn't pull away. This is not your sin. It is mine. Deku looked at him, confused. What? I did this to you, Toshinori said, his voice cracking. I found a boy with the heart of a true hero, a boy who would run into danger without a thought for himself, and what did I do? I gave him a god's power and told him to bear it. I told him he was my successor. I named him the next symbol of peace. I put the weight of the entire world on the shoulders of a 15-year-old child. He shook his head, his own self-recrimination a bitter taste in his mouth. I taught you how to fight. I taught you how to smash. But I never taught you how to cope. I never taught you how to lead a team, how to delegate, how to share the burden. Because I never learned how to do it myself. The confession stunned Deku into silence. I was the symbol of peace, Toshinori continued, his gaze lost in the past. And I was alone. I had friends, of course. Night Eye, Gran Torino, Tsukachi. But I never let them carry the weight with me. I thought it was my burden to bear alone. I smiled to reassure the world, but that smile was also a mask. It kept people at a distance. It made them see the symbol, not the man. I thought it was my duty to be invincible, so I never showed my weakness, never asked for help. And in doing so, I taught you the same terrible lesson. I taught you that being the symbol of peace meant being utterly and completely alone. He looked at Deku, his sunken eyes filled with a father's sorrow. The man you became, your isolation, your belief that you had to carry it all, that is a reflection of my own greatest failing. I gave you my power, but I also gave you my solitude. And for that, my boy, for that, I can never forgive myself. Tashinori's own tears were flowing freely now, a rare and shocking sight. He was not just crying for the broken man in front of him, but for the boy he had failed, for the terrible future he had unwittingly helped create.